right? So, the first thing we need to know is that populations are not always the same place to place and time to time. They vary in space and time, number one. And so, we want to be able to measure those changes as they go up, down, over time and space. And we want to be able to identify what's responsible for that increase or decrease, both ecologically in short time scales and evolutionarily over longer time scales. What's causing those fluctuations? The fluctuations are referred to as ecological dynamics. So whenever you hear that people say, I'm talking about the ecological dynamics of a system, they're referring to the growth or decline of population size typically. All right? So let's talk about population. Is this room a population? Absolutely. 2 or more individuals, same species, defined geographic location. So it's going to have all the attributes of any typical population. So ultimately, the population size of this room is set by what? What determines how many people can be in this room? The number of what? Seats. That's it. There's 300 something seats in here. No more. That's it. Any more than that, you could potentially do it, but the fire marshal would find us and kick everybody out. So theoretically, we have a set size. That's resources. So ultimately, the number of organisms in any given locality is set by the resources. But a population can increase or decrease. So there are different ways that it can increase or decrease. So when you started out in this room, theoretically, before you came in, how many people were here? Between the passing periods? 0. There might have been somebody just by luck of the draw who happened to have a class in here earlier, right? But theoretically, there's probably 0. But then it grew, and it grew quickly. So what particular attribute allowed it to grow? You came in the door. What's that called? It was a form of dispersal, and what is it? It's immigration with an I. When the class is over today, what will you do? You will leave. You'll walk out the door, and you will emigrate with an E. Or you'll stay in here for some reason. I don't know why you want to stay in here. But you might. But most of you will leave. However, this room could also grow in different ways. Let's do an experiment now. So you come into class like any normal day. You sit down. You hear the doors close. But then before you know it, you hear machinery. And you go to look and you realize that the doors have been welded shut. And now you're trapped in here. And all of a sudden, a little hole right there in the top of the roof opens up, and water and food comes down every couple days. That's it. And you can't get out. And that goes on for 20 years. Can the numbers in this room go up and go down?
Yes.
Absolutely. How can they go down?
Yeah.
You can die. You can get sick, right? Maybe there's not enough food. So what happens then? You starve to death, or someone maybe wants to eat you, right? So maybe there's some nefarious things going on in the room. Could it grow if there was plenty of food?
Yes.
How would it grow? It'd be birthed. It might not be pretty. It's all in the same room. But in 20 years in here, a whole new society would erupt in this room, right? So you can increase or decrease any population via birth and death rates. So that's it. Those 5 things dictate how a population is going to grow, decline, or remain stable. So population density then is set by birth rates, natality, death rates, mortality, dispersal, immigration coming in with an I, emigration going out with an E. That's it. That's all. Super simple, right? Resource, natality, mortality, integration, emigration, that controls the population dynamics of whether a population goes up, stays stable, or declines. That's it. All right. So how do you measure density then? Well, density is simply the number of individuals per unit area. Is it easy to measure the density in this room? Yeah. Super easy. Do a head count, calculate the surface area here, boom, done. How do you do it for water? It's just volume. Same basic idea, but it's 3-dimensional space instead. So that's how you measure it. Now, how do you do that? Well, total counts is the most accurate way to do it. I can just walk around 1, 2, 3, 4. If I do it slow enough, what's my accuracy going to be? Perfect. If I take my time, I'll get a perfect count. As long as you're not moving around, right? I'll get a perfect count. But what's the problem? It's impractical. And what about my time and labor? It took forever. So for this room, I could do it. What if I had to do that for all of UCSB? I'm like, stay still. 1, 2, 3. It's really impossible, right? So this is by far the most accurate measurement, but it's really impractical or impossible depending on the size of a population. I want to count all the sardines in the Pacific Ocean. Total count? Not going to happen. So you need something smaller, right? More practical to apply. So if you can't do a total count, maybe do a subsampling method. And so here's a nice example. So here's our barnacles again, and they're all sitting on the rock, okay? Oh, I guess my... There you go. That's blind you by pointing the wrong way. I'm sorry about that. And this pointer is illegal too, which is really cool. It's damaging to the retinas if I just hit you. It's one of those ones where you shine at a plane, you end up in jail. But I bought it anyway because it's super good for Campbell Hall, right? And when I get bored, I run outside and I shine it at the plane. So it works. So anyway, this would be a subsample method. Here's our big population that's sitting on this big giant rock. Well, what if I had to measure an entire reef off of Devereaux Point by myself? That gonna happen? No. So I need something smaller than I need to extrapolate out. So I go to a couple rocks and I lay down what would be a subsampling method. In this case, a transect. And it's just a little grid. And I slap the grid on the rock and I just count all the barnacles that I found in the grid. And then what I do is I calculate the overall area and I just extrapolate out. If there's X amount of barnacles here, if there's this much area, there's going to be X amount of barnacles in total. Does that make sense? So, did my labor go down? Yes. Did my time go down? But what also went down? Accuracy. Because here's the problem. I do this randomly. I just throw it out there without any bias. The problem is, if I do it right here, am I likely to get an over, under representation, or accurate representation of the overall habitat? Over, under, or accurate? Look at it, the whole thing. Over, under, accurate. Over. Every single piece of that grid is filled up with a barnacle, right? But are there any barnacles there? No. What about over here? No. So this is actually overrepresented because basically it's saying the entire surface area should be filled up. Well, what if my grid by just sheer chance landed right there? Would I over, under, or accurately measure? I totally underestimated. I'd say there's hardly any barnacles, but it's full. I'd get lucky if I kind of was right over here someplace, right? That would be better average. But because of the way you do this, you're just randomly throwing it out. So I'm never sure, so you're getting some error. So my accuracy decreases in terms of what's really going on, okay? My ease of time and labor went way up. My overall accuracy of actually calculating what's really there went down. All right, there's lots of ways to do that. Now, for things that don't move, this barnacle adult is again sessile or motile? Sessile. Easy to count because it can't run away. What if I have to count that? Easy to do? Hell no, because that will fly away. Birds and fish are notoriously difficult to count, right? I'd like you to go count by yourself a herd of zebra. No satellite imagery, just you. Easy to do? Forget it. There's a lot. It's not going to happen. They're running away from you, okay? So there's other methods to subsample besides the transect method I just showed you, or the quadrat method. Transect would be a line. I just count on the line. Quadrat is the grid. So in this case, this is a marker recapture technique, and it's often used for birds and fishes, especially for fishes. So these are trout. And trout are fast, and trout are smart. And if you try and count them when you're underwater, you'll fail miserably, and your counts will be completely inaccurate. So as an example, I'm an aquatic biologist, and I work with trout quite a bit, and I do population surveys all the time. And I used to work in the private sector for consulting firms doing this too. And I went out to a local river up here that still had trout in it, and I had a permit to electroshock them. And so I could go out to the river with this big electroshocker, which is really cool, and you throw it in there and it screws up their lateral line system. They float to the surface, you net them, you count them. And I walked maybe about a quarter mile of river and did this little survey. You have to be permitted to do that. I have one of those. And I calculated that there were X amount of these steelhead, these really highly endangered fishes per unit area within this river. And I had this nice metric, and it was like, wow, nobody's going to be able to screw with this river because there's all these endangered fishes. And then I had the contractor who was working for the development agency there. And so I was contracted by the state, and then there was another contractor who was contracted by the private developer who wanted to develop the land on the river. And so they came out and they did the same survey. And my survey showed that there were 3 fish per meter or something like that, right? and their survey showed 0 fish per quarter mile. And so it wasn't that they were being nefarious about it, but their method of sampling was different. So my method was to electroshock, grab them, count them, put them back. They did not have that particular permit, so instead they used the snorkeling technique, where they just went along the river and stuck their head in the river and counted the fish, or jumped into the river if it was big enough and counted the fish. Why do you think they got 0? Because fish are freaking smart. And if you jump into the river, what do they think is going on? It's like this giant behemoth creature is jumping into my home. Am I going to sit there and go, please count me? So they dart for cover immediately, and they're amazingly fast. So he didn't see anything because they were all hiding, right? So that's a classic example of how your particular manner of assessment can radically address your outcome. So how do you do it in a big place, like a big river or a pond, big lake or something like that, where you really can't count everything manually? Well, a marker recapture technique is a way to do it. So there's a very simple way. What you're going to do is this. You're going to go out to the habitat, and I'll go and I'll make a little subset of that habitat. And let's say we do it for a lake. Well, you can use that electroshocking method, and you can do it at a bigger scale. So you get like a pontoon boat, and you hook up all these big batteries to it, and one side of the boat is positive and one side is negative, and you're like, clear, and it sends this big electrical current down to the bottom, it stuns all the fish, they belly up, and you just scoop them up and count them at your leisure. And you can get pretty accurate representation in that particular area of how many fish there are. Then what you do is, of the fish you collect, you mark them. And you can mark them in lots of different ways. You can put some paint on them, you can take a little fin clipping out of them, you can do all kinds of ways that you can mark the fish. And then you release them back into the landscape. And then you make an assumption. And your assumption is they're going to go back and distribute themselves normally like they were before. That's a big assumption. So I want you to remember that. Then what you do is at some time t later, you come back and you shock it again. And then you see how many fish did I catch that are marked in that second sample, right? Because you're never going to catch all of them, right? So how many are actually marked in that second sample? From that information, I can make a population determination. So this is how you do it. You take the marked animals in the second sample divided by the total captured in the second sample is equal to the marked animals in the first sample divided by the population size, n. All right? And so, you're going to do that. So log in with your iClickers, please. So here's your parameter values. You went out to this particular lake, and in the first capture, you collected 9 trout and you marked them. Then you came back sometime later, and in your second sample, you catch 9 fish again, but only 3 of them are marked. So based on the amount you originally captured and marked, and the amount you captured in the second, and the ones that were previously marked, I want you to tell me what the total population size trout is in this lake. Can you do that? All right, get together in your groups and do that to me, and then input your answer.
Oh, that's a count, right?
Give me a few more seconds, put your value in place. All right, I'll stop this poll. consensus on C. Let's take a look and see if C is it. C is it. So how do you calculate that? It's pretty basic. You just plug and chug, right? So marked animals in the second sample was 3. Total captured in the second sample was 9. Marked animals in the first sample was 9 over n, which is the total population size. Rearrange, that gives you 8. 81 over 3 divided, that gives you 27 trout. So the estimated population size of this lake is 27 animals. Is that going to be 100% accurate? No. Highly doubtful. Will it be in the ballpark? Probably. Okay? Depending on the quality of your survey, the size of the lake, the quality of your shocking tools, and your crew. Now, all that stuff goes into play. But it's going to give you a ballpark that's probably fairly reasonable. So expect to see that on an examination. Okay? Just like that. I might change the animal, I'll change the numbers, but the basic process is the same. Birds are in a flock. Of these birds, you capture such and such, you mark this amount. The second capture, this amount was basically previously marked, calculate the population size. All right, that's a simple tool. It's another tool in your tool belt as an ecologist. So sometimes even that doesn't work. So I'm dealing with birds, and sometimes birds are really problematic because they're not constrained by fish in a lake. Well, they're fish in a lake. They can only go so far. But a bird, yeah, a bird can fly a lot further, and they can fly really far away. So sometimes they're impossible. There's lots of organisms that are just too tough to measure via either total sampling or subsampling methods. So we need to use an indirect indicator. The bird might fly away, but what does it leave? It leaves poop behind, and what else does it leave? Eggs behind, nests behind, and so I can use that stuff. Does a nest run away? Does an egg run away? Poop definitely doesn't run away. All right? So all that stuff is there. And I can just stroll out at leisure. Maybe all the birds flew away, but I can just count all that stuff. What's the problem with that? It's not accurate at all. Was it easy to do? Yeah. Oh, by far it's the easiest, the least labor intensive. I can do it all, no problem. But here's the thing, I'm calculating the amount of birds based on the amount of nests. What if the nests are in the trees? How many of those am I going to miss? A lot. What if I base it on the amount of eggs? Maybe they all haven't laid their eggs, right? What does it mean if there's multiple eggs, no eggs? I don't know. So again, all that stuff comes into play. So indirect indicators are by far the easiest, time and labor-wise, but by far the sloppiest in terms of accuracy, right? So you have to really well mesh your sampling methodology with the organisms in play, and often it's the best you got. It's not perfect, it rarely is. When you look out in nature, populations take fairly common distribution patterns, and so the spacing of individuals in the population is really interesting. We talked about some basic spacing patterns in this class, right? Distribution patterns. Well, populations do that. There are 3 major dispersion patterns of a population, dispersion meaning the pattern of their organization. The first and by far the most common is clump. So what you see is individuals of the same species have a tendency to be distributed in really discrete groups. Very common in nature, see it all the time. We do it, fish do it, birds do it, all kinds of things do it, right? It's typically due because in the world, are resources completely uniformly distributed? No. Am I going to find coral reef fishes sitting in open ocean? No, they need coral. So certain attributes of the environment naturally restrict. Also, you see a lot of social behaviors. Fish accumulate together in schools for what? Protection. How does a school work? You guys know? So where's the best place to be in a school? In the very middle, out on the edges, or somewhere in between? How many people think it's out on the edges? Okay. Here's the advantage of being out on the edge. What's the primary advantage of being on the outside of a school? Do you know? Food. You get primary access to food when you find it. You're the first at the food. What's the big negative? You're the first to get attacked. So there's a definite negative consequence. Well, if I don't want to be attacked, what's the best place for me to sit? Right in the middle of the school. What's my problem? No food. Everybody ate it before I got there. So what's the best place to be? Somewhere in between, where you're balancing your food acquisition and your risk of predation. So that's what a school does. It kind of balances out. Now here's the thing. I actually increase the predation risk of the overall group because now I'm a big giant mass of fish and I attract more predators. But my individual risk does what? Down, 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 down. Even though the group risk went up, my individual risk goes down. So that would be a clump dispersion pattern. These emperor penguins are a nice example of a uniform dispersion pattern. Now notice how they're standing. If I was to calculate the distance between, is it random? It's very uniform. It's like a meter, a meter, a meter, a meter, a meter. It's like a meter between these birds. What dictates the distance between them? How are they maintaining it? Social behaviors. In particular, what kind of social behavior?
Nesting.
What is it?
Nesting.
It is nesting. And how are they maintaining the distance between the nests?
How far they can reach.
How far they can reach. So if you were to do the calculation, these are pretty tall birds, right? These are emperor penguins. They're like this tall. They're big. So what happens is, as far as they can lean over and bite and peck their neighbor, that's the space they generate around them. And since mature adults are basically the same size, right, with just a little variation, the distance between them is relatively the same size. If you encroach on my space, what will happen? I'll bite the hell out of you and you'll back up. All right? And so they are able to defend that little resource space around them. So social behaviors, interaction between individuals, often results in this uniform dispersion pattern. And then the last one is found, but it's not as common, and that's a random dispersion pattern. You often see this in weeds like dandelions. You see it a lot in barnacles in some cases. You see it in things that are dependent on the wind and the water currents to move them around as larval forms. Okay? In this case, it's seeds, right? Or it's pollen, moving pollen from one place to another in the winds. And you're at the mercy of that current. So wherever it drops you, that's where you end up living, right? Wherever the current moved that day, that's where you plop down. And so that leads to this kind of just random dispersion pattern. Wherever you land, that's where you're at. You have to be careful with dispersion patterns because they change with the scale of investigation. So for instance, if I was to look at this pattern at the scale of investigation of where it's actually occurring, which is social interactions, it's uniform. But as I zoom out in spatial scale, let's say I'm on a satellite and I can zoom in this quick, and then I zoom out, this dispersion pattern will change. Will it look like this or will it look like that? If it ends up going that way, it looks like this. Why? What do these guys need to mate? What habitat? They're in the Antarctic, and what are they? Are they on the ice? They're on what? They're on thawed ice that's now rock. They don't do it on the ice. So what happens is as you zoom out, what you will see is patches of rock that they're on, ice that they are not, and what will it look like? Just like that. Wherever the patches are rocks, that's where the penguins will be. Now it would be considered to be a what pattern of dispersion? Clump, but it's actually driven as uniform because you need to find the appropriate measuring scale for how they're interacting. So it's really tricky. All right, so again, patterns of dispersion change with scale. Let's talk about natality, which is simply the number of offspring produced per unit time, completely dependent on the organism. So here's some examples of birth rates. A single oyster produces 55 to 114 million eggs per year. That's a hell of a lot of offspring, right? However, how many of them survive? A tiny little fraction of that, okay? Birds lay about 1 to 20 eggs per year, depending on the species. Mammals bear about 1 to 10 offspring, okay? So it goes down depending on who you are and what you do for a living. But that's not what's really important, is how many you produce, it's how many basically survive, right? So in this case, how do you measure natality? Well, natality is this simple equation. P sub x is a function of B sub x divided by N sub x. Well, what does that mean? This is just a symbolic representation of per capita birth rate is a function of the number of births, but here's the most important part, over the size of the reproductive population. Notice it's not the total population. So for instance, if we were to do this for human beings, would it be 8 billion people? No. Nope. It's going to be far fewer than that. Because when do human beings become reproductively ready? Capable? Depending on the area of the world, about 12 to 13. Okay? That's when you become reproductively capable. And then you phase out as you get older. When does that occur?
45?
Yeah, typically right in the early 60s sometime for most. So that's the window like 13 to 60, right in there. That's kind of your window. That would be the size of the reproductive population. It'd actually be even smaller than that because certain things happen to people along the way. Certain people are born sterile. Some people have accidents and they're sterilized because of them, right? Maybe you have a really low sperm count or a low egg count for a variety of reasons. So again, your reproductive viability goes down. So the size of the reproduction population is actually much smaller than the total population size. All right, let's do a quick calculation. I have some robins over here. The reproductive population of these robins is 1,000 birds, and there's 100 birds within that population. What's the birth rate? You don't even need to think much about this one. Just pop it in real quick, okay?